Right now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this session on ethical decision making. And we have Mark Koziel and Caleb Bullock and Greg LaFollette, and I'll let each of them give you a brief introduction to themselves.
Morning, Gail.
Hi.
Mark Koziel, Executive Vice President of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants.
Excellent.
Good morning, Gail. Thanks for having us. I'm Caleb Bullock with Somerset CPAs out of Indianapolis.
Morning, Gail, and I'm Greg LaFollette. I'm a strategic advisor with CPA.com, and I live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Excellent. So, gentlemen, today we'd like to talk about ethics, and all of you have different roles in terms of positions or former positions on ethics committees and ethics boards, so it's a really good panel to be discussing this topic. And I think we should just start with kind of a general definition of what is ethics. Well,
let me take that, Gail, make a quick run at it. You talked about background in ethics. I chaired the ethics committee for the South Dakota State Society for 17 years. I had to move out of the state to get off that committee. And I currently chair the ethics committee for the city of Sioux Falls. And it's a different role. It's not a professional role, semi-legislative in that case. But so I've been involved in the ethics of CPAs for a very, very long time. And I mean, I kind of look at, it'll be interesting to hear what my colleagues think about it, but I kind of look at ethics as being a code of moral standards. So ethics isn't the same as lawful. Ethics are principles-based as opposed to rules-based. And that's where a lot of our problems come in, because if you consider a speed limit as an example. A speed limit is 55 miles an hour. That's all rule. A principle would be the speed limit is reasonable and prudent. And then we have to argue about what that is. And people tend to want hard, especially CPAs, who want, well, what is the rule? And ethics is always, well, what's reasonable and prudent. So it's what's good, what's right, as opposed to what's bad or what's wrong. So it's not, there are not necessarily bright lines. That said, we have a code of ethics, and there are lots of examples, but that's what they are. They are examples. They're not rules. I think that's a fair way to say it, isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree. I think of ethics as being more of a state of mind and wearing an ethical lens rather than I do the black and white. So often, we get questions from CPAs in the Indiana Ethics Committee, of which I'm a member, that really doesn't have a black and white answer. You can look at the code to see what the baseline direction is that you need to pursue, but for the most part, there's some ambiguity and a lot of different scenarios that CPAs are facing. So I would agree.
And with that, what type of support do the firms or the employers give to their professionals, their young professionals especially? I think that they haven't been as attuned to the different principles that are out there. What does public interest mean? The CPAs in the 70s and 80s got more of a perspective about that public interest. But if I'm not doing anything, if I only see this client relationship and I don't necessarily understand what the public good is around that, then how am I bringing that back into the ethical code? So the principles we have around the ethics, everyone seems to want to focus around independence as this big thing that's all our ethics are designed around, but there's so much more to it. Due care and objectivity and the like, and integrity first and foremost. So there's a lot to it.
And I think that's really important, Mark, because it oftentimes we look at ethics or in the profession as almost burdensome. I have these rules to follow, and kind of tacking on to what you said, those are really they're like a competitive advantage. They're a differentiator. They set CPAs above at the pinnacle of the whole accounting profession. That's, at least that's the way I see it.
Yeah, and when you look at the competitive marketplace, so audit really still is the only regulatory service that we have that the CPA is bound to, right? Yet we have all these other services we're providing to the public that we have competition outside the CPA community. So by being able to say we have this code of professional conduct, it's in our state regulatory system, each and every one. And by the way, use me as a CPA for your tax or your client accounting. I am bound by what these things are, and you can't get that unless you're going with a CPA. So I think that's really the differentiator that can set us apart.
Now, Greg, you said something about comparing ethics to lawfulness. And are there situations where something that's ethical can actually be unlawful?
So there are examples of, sure. So if I have made, this would be probably, it can be illegal to forget to file something. That's not unethical. It's not unethical to miss a filing deadline. It may be, well, that's not really unlawful, but it's a bad thing. So you can break a regulation or a rule and not be unethical. You can also be unethical by not having a system. So let's say you're running a firm and you don't have a due date monitoring system. You just go, I'll try and remember everything. And if you look at that, even though you didn't have a penalty over here, just by virtue of not doing a good job, that is unethical.
Right, due care.
Right, that's the due care.
Okay. We're going to just real briefly take not a break, we're not leaving, but a break from our conversation to display the first CPE code for this session. So that's going to appear on the bottom of your screen, and just write down this 3-digit number and save it. You'll get 2 more during this session, and that will be your evidence of having attended. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about ethical behavior and how it affects the accounting profession as a whole. Any thoughts on that?
I'm interested in Caleb because I know you're sitting on a committee now, and just some of the things that you see from a profession standpoint. You talked about ambiguity. I think that's a great place to start for that.
Sure, and I would echo some of the comments that were made previously. I think that it really is the biggest and best value proposition that the profession has, in the community, especially as the profession starts to change and we start to see, diversifying, what our capabilities are, getting more into being a financial partner maybe than a traditional tax accountant or auditor. Now we're seeing that professional CPA start to change, and what our value proposition is as a CPA. And I think that the baseline of that ethical lens that we see things through is really the one constant that will be maintained through all of this significant change that people are talking about. And really, what's the main difference between a CPA and an accountant, or a CPA and another professional services person? And I think it's the fact that there's an expectation that a CPA has that ethical lens that we see things through. And it's, again, in excess of the code of conduct, the black and white, it's the understanding that that's the way that we see every decision through that lens. So.
Yeah, it's interesting as you say that, and just it makes me think as a profession. So we think about the AICPA and the association, right? And in the U.S. primarily, we have over 400,000 members of the association. And of that, about half are in business, industry, and government, who still maintain their CPA and are being held to that code of conduct, and from a business and industry perspective. And even there, they're using it as a differentiator. Or when you talk to a CFO and say, I want to make sure that I have CPAs on staff, or I'm going to get staff to get the CPA because I want them held to that ethical standard. I could go to the audit committee and say that our finance team has this code that they're all going to follow because they have it in the key positions that are there, and letting people know that, you know, personally you have to follow those principles, I think really carries through.
And I think it's important too to keep in mind that in addition to the understanding that, hey, I've got a CPA on board, they're adhering to this code of conduct, but you know, there's a phrase that's kind of riddled throughout the code of conduct that talks about what a reasonable person, you know, that has all the fact patterns, deem this to be objective or deem this to be ethical. And I think that's a very valuable point to make, that in addition to adhering to a code of conduct, you know, CPAs have this professional skepticism about the decision-making process.
Right.
So, to me, the important thing, you know, you look at all the larger profession, including the bookkeepers and the accountant, all of the people who are in accounting, and I'm going to say most, if not all, are ethical people. But without a code of ethics, without that codification, there's not necessarily a proof of that, and that gets me back to the differentiator. So I want to make sure that nobody thinks we're saying just because you're not a CPA you're unethical.
Right.
It's just having that standard and being able to point at it, and having boards of ethics and ethics committees to interpret and to handle advice. And as being a part of the ethics committee, a big part of that is giving our colleagues advice. When they would come and say, this is a situation I have, and I'm trying to be a reasonable person. Here are the facts. Help me decide what's the best thing to do.
You know, as I think about ethics and having it, the code that we have for CPAs, and I think my brief stint out of public accounting before I joined the AICPA, I went to work for a client in political media, right? And I was the media planning director over, and basically time buy, right? So we did time buy for political and public affairs campaigns. And they started to use the fact that their director of media planning was a CPA, which had absolutely nothing to do with media planning whatsoever. But the fact that they had that and the trust level, and all of a sudden it's this ethical thing, and it's amazing how by having that code and the trust that it still builds, you know, and when Caleb, you were talking before about, you know, in the profession when we had the Enrons of the world and what that did to the profession, and yet ethics still, because of our code of conduct, you know, the ship was pointed in the right direction to make sure that people were held accountable for that. I think that's the big thing, and you've seen that, Greg, over years.
Exactly. You know, and it's interesting. I was thinking about this morning, Mark, in the political world. You know, we're talking a lot about ethics right now, and you know, in both the Senate and the House, we have ethics committees investigating things, and in that world, there is no code. So here's a differentiator: there is no code, and the ethics committees, and I'm using air quotes there, those ethics committees are really, they're courts of law, except with not being judicial, but they're courts of inquiry. They're not enforcing or interpreting an existing code of conduct. They're making it up retroactively.
Right.
You know, which is pretty scary if you happen to be examined.
Right.
When we talk about codes of conduct, we've got the AICPA has a code of conduct, and the state societies use the same thing.
Many do, or the state boards. Then there are many states that adopt the AICPA code in mass, or others that take elements of that and expand upon it. So there's variations of that, though.
So what about when we get to the firm level? I think I know, I used to work at Deloitte, and one of the things we did when we first started was we all had to sign documents, indicating our independence and any investments that we had, and also there were ethical standards in those documents that we were expected to withhold, and we had to sign those documents. So is that common in firms?
You know, I would say while that may be common in firms, I think the more important piece, you know, in public accounting is that institutional knowledge and that understanding and that expectation that's set with younger people coming out of college, that really this is our differentiator. Not only is it, not only are you required to sign the form, but it's also important that you adhere to what the form is saying. And a lot of times it's, you know, the younger folks, you know, whether it be, you know, audit compliance with, you know, your documentation, your audit evidence, you know, independence issues, whatever it may be, it's not necessarily a case where they are deliberately trying to be unethical. It might be a case where they just don't know. And so I think that institutional knowledge, the more tenured or senior CPAs, there's a responsibility there to share that ethical value proposition with the younger folks too, at the firm level.
So those documents don't prove or even indicate that the firm is ethical, and not having them doesn't prove that they're unethical. But the very fact that that a firm has a process that says every year we're going to ask every staff member to list material investments so we can make sure that we don't have an independence impairment somewhere. That may or may not actually prove anything, but it is a baseline, and it does show that the firm is thinking about it. It's not unlike, you know, you have a form where, you know, now everybody has a sexual harassment form, you know, that they have to fill out and say, you know, I recognize that. So at least at that one point, everybody's thinking about that. And I think that's an important thing.
You get it. You see it a lot of times, like in the employee handbook, that they'll have the ethical standards kind of listed out with that. The independence form separate and distinct. In small firms, so I think this is where I think there's opportunity for more, and to understand. I think, Greg, to your point, that, you know, signing a document or having everyone inside the organization thinking about it annually as a reminder that these are the things that we adhere to, not just as a profession, but as a firm, that we want to stand up to that and make sure that we are held to that standard, I think becomes very important. It's too easy to say we're going to do it for audit because of independence issues that we have there more than any. But, you know, public interest, integrity, objectivity, due care, your scope of services all still applies to tax, to client accounting, that due care especially. Is it in every engagement letter to tell clients that we are going to use due care in what we do, and say that? The insurance, you know, providers and your professional liability say that should be in there. You should be talking about that.
So you're out trying to build a firm, and you're trying to build your book of business. You know, we have a responsibility. We have an ethical responsibility before we accept an engagement to satisfy ourselves that we have the requisite knowledge to take on that engagement. Well, what does that mean? It's sure I have 4 people in my office, and I have technically, I have the right to audit any company in the world, but I don't have the requisite knowledge. I can't do that. Now, some of those are real easy, but there's a lot of those decisions where, you know, a good, solid, ethical look that says maybe we're not equipped to handle that engagement. Maybe it's too big, maybe it's too complex, maybe it's outside our area of expertise, and I wonder how many of us think about that part as much as we do think about the time utilization and the potential billings and the relationships and things like that.
Sure. There's a lot of that you see. I mean, you know, the audit of employee benefit plans. I mean, that was fast and furious. And we've actually done an internal study on some of the single audits that were out there and seeing that. And even, so the employee benefit plan, and this is not a firm size issue, but fact is, the fewer you do, the less likely you are of being an expert in that particular thing, no matter what it is, right? You know, I've fixed a sink once, doesn't make me a certified plumber. In fact, I worry that it's not even going to work tomorrow by the time I get done. So
provides employment for certified plumbers.
That's right. So when you look at that and say, okay, I'm a tax partner and I have this construction client I've had for years, and they've now kicked over the 100 employee requirement. But it really is a tax return because it's a 5,500. I can knock this thing out, right? It's limited scope, so I don't really need, and then all of a sudden I'm going to do that and have never done an employee benefit plan audit before. That's where we get into trouble. And so I think thinking about that from a due care perspective, getting the right experts in becomes important.
All right, we're going to take a quick break here and come back and talk about some real-life examples of ethics situations that we hope you can relate to. But first we want to hear a little bit from our sponsor, CORE by BQE. So we'll take a little commercial break, and when we come back, you'll get your second CPE code for this session, so don't go away. And then we'll continue with our presentation.
Well, let's see, pencil pusher, nerd, number cruncher, bean counter. Believe me, we've heard it all. There's this preconceived notion of what we do, of who we are, a caricature of sorts. It's really quite amusing. I'd say that running an accounting firm has created within me this sort of alter ego, kind of a master problem solver type. You know, oftentimes we're brought into situations with new clients and their existing practices are just in chaos. You've got unpaid taxes, high receivables, unreconciled accounts. I mean, the list goes on and on. What we get to do is come into an organization, analyze the situation, and begin to execute. Slowly, we peel back the layers and help them become more profitable. It's incredibly satisfying. Engaging with a large number of clients on various levels comes with an abundance of administrative tasks. These were really diverting me away from engaging with my clients and helping them. With BQE Core, I can see who's working on what. And with the dashboards, I know exactly what's happening in real time. I'm able to easily manage everything, from reviewing time and expenses to receiving and approving invoices. CORE has allowed us to simplify our many moving parts, resulting in a real gain in efficiency and ultimately allowing me to focus on bringing in new business. It's reassuring to know that our clients also use CORE now. Sometimes it's all about setting a great example and allowing the numbers to speak for themselves.
Welcome back. You should see at this point the second CPE code on your screen for this session, so be sure to write that down and save it. Okay, and then also we'd like to do a quick poll with you, and this is not a poll to get your CPE credits. This is totally optional, and we don't want you to leave the screen. So we'd like, if you've got your cell phone handy and can use your phone to answer a poll question, we'd like to try this and see how this works. So all you need to do is go to Slido, sli.do.com, slido.com. And when you do that, you'll need to enter a code for this session, which is ES, as in Ensuring Success, 2017. All right. And when you get there, you should see a question It asks if you have a written code of conduct in your firm. And we'd just like to get an idea of how many people actually have a code of conduct in their firm that's written, that they know of. And you should see the results coming in as you answer the question. That we can see, and I can monitor them here and see what kind of results we're getting. So that's Slido, sli.do.com, and ES 2017 is the code. And so far the answers are coming in a little bit heavier towards no written code of conduct. A few are working on it. And some do have a code of conduct and it's in force. Okay, so we'll leave that on the screen for just another 10 seconds or so if you'd like to answer. And meanwhile, we'd like to talk about some real-life examples of ethical situations that we think could actually apply in most every case. So whether you're coming in from a large firm or even a sole proprietor or anywhere in between, one of the things we'd like to speak about is client records. And we think there's some major ethical situations to consider, particularly if you're transitioning your firm in some way. So if you gentlemen would like to address that.
Yeah, sure. Obviously this is a big issue. Our clients trust us with due care, with their, they trust us with their pertinent information, and especially in today's world with the cybersecurity threats, and you hear of, compromised financial information and otherwise almost on a daily basis. So it's something that our clients are worried about. It's something that they're thinking about. And while a lot of us say that we're paperless, we live in a paperless world, we're still drowning in paperwork. So what do you do with those records? There's certain responsibilities that you have as a CPA when transitioning a business, and whether that means that you're retiring or whether you're selling your practice. And the question becomes, what do you do with those records? And so, there's some, we talk about the difference between ambiguity in the code and black and white, and there's some pretty good black and white tangible actions that you need to take when you are transitioning your practice. Including contacting your clients to let them know. And Mark, I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, so as June 30th of 17 was when the new requirement was put in to the code, that the seller is responsible for obtaining written consent from their clients that they're able to move that information. Now you could do that and you could say, okay, you can notify your clients and then go with a kind of negative confirmation. If within 90 days we don't hear from you, we will assume it's okay. But this is sale, merger, whatever it is. So even if you're going into the new organization, there is a notification process to let your clients know or give your clients the ability to decide whether or not they are comfortable with their information being moved to what that new entity is.
And that's a written confirmation?
That is a written confirmation,
and
yes.
Does email count, or does it have to be?
It's a great question. I'm not sure about email counting versus letters. I'm sure it does in some way to show proof. But again, there's the notification process where if you didn't get positive, because you're not going to get everybody to write it back. So, can you at least prove that you did provide the notice and allow for the opportunity for them to reply, give a written confirmation that they're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And that just goes back to the reasonable, prudent man thing. Is did I make a good faith effort, or did I just walk away and throw away the key? Right. So you have to do this. So this whole work paper thing has been problematic in the ethics world forever, in even determining whose property work papers are. You hear those cases, and I know you've heard of. I heard a lot of those cases. I have books of original entry, and then I have my work papers, and occasionally it's usually around a fee dispute, and Some accountant says, I just got fired, and now the client wants the books and records, and I'm not going to give them to him till he pays me. Well, it's not your obligation is to provide the books of original entry, and even though they may be things that you prepared, they're still books of original entry, perhaps. So, from an ethical framework, you would look at it and say, not what's best for me, but what's best for, what's the right thing to do, not what's the vindictive thing to do. Mark, when you talked about the cyber part, that scares me, because I spent a lot of time in the technology side of the profession, and I think our exposure to ethical violations by having non-existent or poor technology practices. There are firms that have so little technology understanding that it reaches, I think, the level of an act discreditable to not have appropriate plans. Right. It's analogous to leaving your work papers in your office and not locking the door intentionally.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And that's where, when firms say, well, I'm concerned about using some type of a cloud-based backup system, or even a cloud-based system itself, because I'm not sure the security yet. The security they have is, the broom propping up the door to make sure that airflow comes into the closet that the server's sitting in. There are controls in place, and I think a reasonable person could assume that someone who is in the security business may be better at it than an individual trying to secure that same data.
Yeah. And here's a point on that. This is the difference between legal and ethical. You may employ some sort of cloud-based system, whatever it happens to be, and you're using that, and that particular service gets hacked and your client's records are compromised. That is not necessarily an ethical violation. Mm-hmm. Now, to have done that without even thinking about it and just going, oh, well, I'll just do it this way, could be an ethical violation even if you didn't lose client records. So that just goes back to the same thing we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Now, we had results from this poll that we did showed that just slightly over 50% of those who participated in the poll don't have, as far as I know, a written code of conduct in their office. So say they are ready to make a decision to do that. What are the steps? How do they start? How do they create something that's going to work?
I'd say start with the state board and the state regulation around it first and foremost, because that's going to be the deciding factor. You have the AICPA code, but you do have to kind of reconcile that up with your individual state if there's additional things. And it is as easy as getting it into the handbook or some type of a written policy. The information's already out there. It's not like you have to write your own, right? It's already kind of written for everyone. And it's just making sure that everyone has that reminder. And I don't know that outside of this wonderful CPE, typical ethics CPE provides that understanding of the principles enough versus just what do I need to know about my state regulation. And that's where having that written code inside your own organization and having people sign it and remind them of it becomes, I think, essential.
Right, and when a firm puts together their code of conduct, it may well encompass, first of all, the AICPA code of conduct, and then the State Society State Board, which both have some fashion codes of conduct, but then they may also have their own. They may have things that the leadership in that firm wants to restate that might be in those other codes, but we want to restate that. I've seen things like there are matters of community support. I don't know that that's necessarily ethical, but we have a firm policy that we encourage our employees to be involved in the community. Things like that are kind of around the edges of a code of conduct.
It's kind of a value proposition as well. I think that's an interesting point, including incorporating into your code of conduct for your firm some ancillary things that you can really hammer home with your younger staff. I know one of the hardest parts is in incorporating your younger staff into the culture of a firm, and having something in writing that is communicated to them that's, hey, here's the code of conduct that we adhere to here at our firm, and whether that's pulled from the state society or from the AICPA or a Frankenstein of the two. But in addition to that, here's some things that we feel like are maybe not ethical issues, but are something that we have a civic responsibility, things that we would like you to do to get involved in the community, and things like that that would really help your firm incorporate your younger folks into the culture and what you're trying to cultivate. So it's an interesting value proposition.
I really like that idea of blending the code of conduct in with general expectations. And that can be also, I would think, like just facts, FAQs about, the kinds of questions that are going to come up. If you're, working on an audit and work paper issues and, this is sort of thing that everybody encounters, what are you going to do about that? And just include that in the list and have it all available in the employee handbook. One of the things that I'd like to have us talk about just a little bit is tax issues, because everybody who does taxes knows what the gray area is. I mean, there's always a gray area when we're working with different types of tax issues where perhaps clients want to push the limit, or you want to push the limit, or that you've tried things before that a lot of tax issues can be explained in a lot of different ways, and you can approach a tax issue from a lot of different standpoints. So where do the ethical guidelines come in when it becomes something that you're willing to go to bat for the client on, but it may not be written out very clearly in the code?
I'm not sure I'm going to go there.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting getting into the illegal area, but I think that where do the accountants, the tax accountants, come down when the client is saying something that you're uncertain is correct?
Well, Again, I don't know about specifics, but I would say if for no other comment than just to say that it's a very difficult situation, right? It's very similar to your example earlier, Greg, about the taking on an audit client, right? You're seeing the financial ramifications, like, oh, this is going to be great for business. This will increase our billable hours, but is it really the right thing to do? Is it the right thing to do to take on this audit client? I think the same argument could be made for some maybe ambiguous tax positions, where if you feel like, hey, I don't feel good about this. This is maybe not the right thing to do, but it's gonna affect my client's bottom line, which makes me look better. How do you balance that? And I think that going back to what I think you said earlier, really at the end of the day, for me, it's if you're thinking about, hey, is this an ethical thing for me to do? If you're wearing that lens at all times, my guess is you're probably going to be making the right decision, or at least thinking through, what the right decision is.
Let's talk about that right decision, because the same fact pattern could be put in front of two CPAs. They come to completely different decisions, and that doesn't mean that one's right and one's wrong.
Sure.
So you've got all the Circular 230 stuff and all of that kind of governs behavior and stuff. But if a client wants to take a tax position that you feel is too far, then you know, you have on one side you have the IRS regulations and things about whether or not that's legal or illegal, whether you have a reporting responsibility. But the other side is the professional ethics side. And if it feels bad to you, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. Now, you know, our clients expect us to be advocates, and you know, you want to be a good advocate, but can you be a good advocate if it doesn't feel right? And that's where ethics comes in. It's that deep feeling in the pit of your stomach about, gee, there's something here. I remember fielding phone calls when I chaired the Society Ethics Committee at home, and I would field phone calls from my colleagues, and they would start with, so I have this situation, I'm not sure if I can, and I would say, you can't. And they'd say, well, we didn't even describe it yet. And I said, well, because if you have to call me, if it feels bad enough that you have to call, you probably shouldn't do it. Right. And I think that's not the same as running a practice, and it's never easy.
No, and I think you're right, though. There is a gut check element to this, right? And so if it doesn't feel right, then I probably shouldn't be doing it. And the question always is the ambiguity created by the CPA, or is the ambiguity being created by the client? Is the client saying, I want you to do this, or I'd like to push the envelope on this, or is the CPA saying, you know what, this particular tax code, I know this happens rarely. The tax code is pretty black and white and easy to understand, but there are times when you look at it and you say, you know, in this situation, you could go one of a couple of different ways. You know, and this is where documentation comes into play, right? So now all of a sudden you're going to have that particular tax situation, and it isn't up to the CPA to decide. I think this is where it becomes unethical, and say to the client, you should do this. And then the client gets audited by the IRS. The IRS says you didn't do it right, and there's penalties and interest on top of that. And what happens? And the CPA gets sued over the fact that happened. In fact, you know, I think tax, in a lot of instances, those are our greatest complaints that we receive are in tax situations more than anything. And I think a lot of that can be, you know, again, a reasonable person documenting the conversation and taking it in a way that becomes that this is a client decision, not the decision of the CPA, I think is important as part of that.
We get into the idea of being sued. You know, you could, in that situation, you know, an accountant might be sued and they might even lose, and it doesn't mean that they were unethical.
Right.
And just because they were ethical doesn't mean that they've got a great defense. You know, it's pretty hard to, if a tax accountant turned down and fired every client that had a technical violation. You know, here's my mileage deduction. Oh, you know, the code says, do you have records to substantiate this mileage deduction? Yes or no? Are those records written? And you say to your client, are those records written? And they go, oh, yeah. Well, you know, is that an ethical violation? Or do you have to say, you're fired because you didn't keep written records? I would think not, but somebody else might think differently.
Let's stop right there because we have to take another break. We'd like to hear from our sponsor one more time, CORE by BQE, and when we return, we'll have your third CPE code.
How do you spend your day? Do you get to focus on what you value? Or do the clutter and repetition distract you from what really matters? What if you had something to make your tedious work all but a thing of the past? What if it gave you the visibility to know exactly what's going on and what your next step should be? What if you were able to just focus on being creative, productive, strategic? With BQE Core, now you can.
Welcome back. And your third CPE code for this session is appearing on the screen now, so be sure to write down this 3-digit code and save that with the other 2, because you'll need that if you want CPE or CE credit for this session. Let's wrap this up a little bit by talking about the consequences that our accountants can face if they do encounter ethical violations.
Loss of license, livelihood.
Right.
You know,
Reputation.
Reputation.
Yeah, reputation more than anything probably hurts.
Yeah, you know, especially, you know, considering what we've talked about, how, you know, our reputation is really our biggest value proposition, right? That's the most important thing about being a CPA is that, hey, we're trustworthy, we're trusted advisors, and when you lose that, you know, what do you have left? And it's a tough spot to be in, to say the least.
So if there is a complaint filed, complaint is, in almost all cases, in my experience, complaint is filed with everybody that you can think of, from City Hall to the AICPA to they send them to the IRS, you know, who has no jurisdiction. But you've got, you know, you have the AICPA, the state board, and the state society, and you know, so you've got all of those things going on. And for an accountant, you know, to have to just to manage those investigations, and there's a whole process that feels very legal. There's a process that accountant's going to go through with the state society. Many state societies participate in the JEEP program. It's the Joint Ethics Enforcement Program. So at least the state society and the AICPA combine, and you know, there's one investigation rather than 2 parallel investigations. That's particularly true, I think, in smaller states as opposed to larger ones, but I'm not sure of that. It's a huge time problem for a CPA to have to go through that. That's another reason to avoid getting into a situation where a complaint might be filed. And some complaints are filed just to be vindictive.
Right.
In fact, a lot of them are.
You know, as you say that too, I think of that client that when you go back to that gut check, the client you never really felt comfortable about anyway, that probably wasn't your most profitable client either.
Right.
That, you know, they were a D client, they required more of your attention, much higher risk, and yet when they came down to it and you got to that point of the accusation of an ethical violation, how much time that's going to take away from the rest of the business to have to be able to defend that. And then you go back in time and you look at the history of that client and say, you know, was it worth it? And in many instances, CPAs will say no.
And if you go to the Find a CPA, the NASBA listing of all the CPAs in the country, you know, one of the things that's listed there is, you know, are there ethics violations? Yes or no? And you know, just having a yes there is, I mean, that doesn't go away. You know, a lot of cases, you know, how many in your experience, Caleb? How many of those cases did you end up doing, like remedial action or things like that, as opposed to suspension or things? What's your experience?
You know, I would say suspension is much less likely than remedial action.
Right.
But you know, the fact remains, to your point, that a lot of times that remedial action is incredibly tarnishing to your professional reputation, and it's something that sticks with you for a long time.
Right.
And I think it's, you know, to your point, Mark, too, from earlier, that's why it's incredibly important. The documentation component of what we do is incredibly important. You know, people typically think, okay, well, auditors, obviously that's an expectation and crucial in order to make sure that you don't get into hot water. Right. But really, outside of the auditing world, you know, documenting, you know, ambiguous, potentially ambiguous tax issues or consulting issues is incredibly important too, to defend against maybe some frivolous, vindictive accusations.
Yeah, in my experience, in order for a CPA to have an ethics violation filed and move through the whole process and actually be removed from membership of the AICPA, and that's because that's really all the Institute can do is just say, okay, we're kicking you out. You know, in order for that to happen, that accountant, by and large, has to work really hard to prove to a lot of people over a long period of time that they don't want to cooperate.
I would agree.
But to that, and to Caleb, your point about, you know, the firms and doing the right thing, the documentation, engagement letters could probably help fend off a number of these cases as they happen because you had a better definition of what the engagement was up front.
Absolutely.
All right, we're out of time, so thank you so much. And don't go away. We have another session coming right up called Creating a Great Customer Experience, and we would like you to stay tuned for that. So we will see you again at the top of the hour, and thank you very much to Core by BQE for sponsoring this session.